Hello, this is Rajiv Talwar, and the purpose of this recording is to discuss users and groups in Ariba. Specifically, our objectives will be to understand user group concepts, primarily what are all the areas that groups impact in the system, and then what are the key business considerations related to users and groups. Groups in Ariba are what define our security framework and are also used to primarily drive approval flows. So we will discuss each of those areas. Then we will initiate a discussion on specific user groups. There are a large number of groups that come prepackaged with Ariba, and we'll go through some key examples that you'll want to map at a minimum to run your system. Finally, we'll set in motion an action plan to begin assigning users to groups in your system. So let's start with the basics. Who will need a user account in Ariba? Well, it sounds obvious, but keep in mind that anyone who is either creating a transaction or approving a transaction in your system will require a user account. They will need access whether their function is for creating, approving, or both. If you have to have an environment that's integrated with one or more upstream modules like sourcing, people who need access to the upstream side would also need an account. When we talk about groups, what are the areas that they impact? And they have a very important function in Ariba. Firstly, groups will determine what specific functions a user can perform in the system. This drives what menu options they will see available to them, as well as what screens they have access to. Groups, as I mentioned earlier, are also a primary driver of our approval flows. Depending on how we define our business rules, they will route to one or more groups for various types of approvals. They can also work in conjunction with something we call an approval queue. An approval queue is a construct that's built on top of an approval group to give you a little bit more control over who is working on what items. Groups are further used to control transaction visibility, who has access to see what items and to what extent across the enterprise. And finally, sometimes groups are used in advanced ways to customize logic. In particular, who has access to certain fields and who does not. And in some cases, they drive certain validations in the system. So as you can see, there are a lot of different ways that we leverage groups in Ariba. Next, let's talk about permissions. So a permission is defined as an access to perform certain system functions. How do you get these permissions? Well, they are bundled with the groups that you are assigned to. So groups, therefore, define your permissions in Ariba. If you belong to a particular group, you will receive all the permissions that are tied to that group. So for example, if you belong to the purchasing user group, you would have the ability to create requisitions in Ariba. If you belong to the receiving agent group, you can create goods receipts in Ariba, and so forth. A key point to note here is that groups and permissions are bundled together. You cannot pick and choose what permissions come with a group. If you belong to a particular group, you will inherit every permission that comes with that group. There are some cases, for example, creating a change order, where users are granted specific permissions just because they're the owner of a document. So for example, if I create a requisition and later on I realize I need to make a change to that requisition, I do not need to belong to any special group to do so. I am the owner of that document, and therefore I'm able to perform that action. Likewise, there are a number of additional cases where the actions that you see on this slide, you have available to you regardless of any group membership. These actions are independent of group membership. So as I mentioned earlier, if I create a requisition and realize I need to change it, I can go ahead and do so. I do not need to belong to any specific group. Likewise, if something is routed for my approval, it may be routed to me because I am someone's supervisor. I don't need to belong to any group to make that supervisory approval. To manually add approvers to an approval flow, anyone is able to do that. You don't need to belong to a group. Similarly, to be added as an approver, if someone else wants to add you, that does not depend on you belonging to any group. If someone wants to create an on behalf of order on your behalf, they can do so regardless of group, and so forth. So just keep in mind there are some actions, as outlined on the slide, that are independent of group membership. Now, when we talk about groups in Ariba, we really break it down between application area and within that area, the access level. So specifically, I'm talking about what you see at the bottom of the slide. An application area refers to a functional area within Ariba. We start off with purchasing. That's really where most things begin, creating a requisition and a purchase order. That's one application area. Once you've received your items physically, you can put a goods receipt in the system. That's a receiving functional area. Following that, the supplier may bill you, and there's an invoice functional area. And eventually, a payment document is issued, so that's payment functional area. It is also possible to establish contracts in Ariba, and so these are the 5 major functional areas we're talking about. Within each of these functional areas, you will also have an access level. So all the groups in Ariba are broken down based on the application area, and within that area, what level of access do you need? Generally, the access levels follow a hierarchy of user being the most basic level, followed by agent 1 step up, followed by manager, and at the highest level, administrator. So let's take a simple example. Purchasing. If I belong to the purchasing user group, that gives me the ability to create a requisition in the system. That's the simplest function. If I belong to the purchasing agent group, I'm typically a buyer in the procurement organization, and I work with those requisitions that have non-standard or ad hoc items on them. One step above that would be purchasing manager, which has access to some of the configuration behind the scenes. And finally, purchasing administrator, which is the top level. Anytime we talk about an administrative function, it is a very powerful function, and you should grant that group on a very limited basis. So most groups follow this hierarchy of access levels, but a key point here is just because you belong to one of the higher levels doesn't necessarily mean you have all the permissions of the levels below it. You will have most of the permissions, but not necessarily all. So for example, if I have purchasing manager access, that does not necessarily mean I have all the permissions of purchasing agent and purchasing user. I probably have most, but not necessarily all. So keep that caveat in mind. The following slide talks about certain groups that are shared between an upstream and a downstream site. So if you happen to have a suite integrated version of Ariba, and you have sourcing or one of the other upstream modules, these groups, if you have permission to these groups upstream, you will also have permission to these groups downstream. As you can see, they primarily have to do with contracts and system administration type of functions. Next, I'd like to talk about custom groups. So I mentioned to you earlier that Ariba comes with a large number of groups prepackaged for you. However, most customers want to set up custom groups. These are groups with specific names that perform specific functions in the system. And that's certainly something that we can do. Primarily, you'll see custom groups come into play with respect to approval flows. Sometimes you'll see them also come into play with advanced logic for things like field visibility and validations. But really the main function is for approval flows, and we can define a custom group as many as you need with whatever names you deem appropriate. But a key caveat for custom groups, on their own, They have no permissions associated with them. They are simply a group with members. If you would like to add permissions to a custom group, you must tie them to one or more out-of-the-box groups. So that mapping must be made in order to get those permissions. And a custom group can be tied to one or multiple out-of-the-box groups. So coming up on the following slides, we will go through some of the specific user groups that come with Ariba. They're broken down into various functional areas, but as I mentioned earlier, these are groups that at a minimum you probably want to have people mapped to run your system. For a comprehensive list of groups and associated permissions, it's always best, of course, to refer to the latest product documentation. Specifically, there is a user and groups workbook that you will be provided. Within that workbook, there will be several tabs, one of which is a dictionary or a glossary of groups. So you may look up a group by its name and see a paragraph describing what permissions come with it. You will also see some other tabs which break down that group to permissions relationship based on a matrix. So for your easy reference and sorting, you can understand better what permissions come with which groups. Also, another key piece of documentation is the notifications reference guide. And this is very helpful because it will tell you if you belong to a particular group, what notifications will you expect to receive. There are certain groups, for example, purchasing agent, that receive quite a few notifications from the system. So it's good to keep that in mind when doing your group's assignments in Ariba. So let's start off with the customer administrator group. Customer administrator is basically your system administrator of Ariba. This is the most powerful group within the entire system, and as such, of course, you want to grant this very sparingly. This will allow you to access data import-export functions and almost all configuration functions. It is also able to see all transactional data in the system. So that is enterprise-wide. So again, it has visibility to everything and access to most configuration areas. So please grant this group sparingly. The next functional category is what we call purchasing groups. As we saw in the previous slide, this is one of our major functional areas. And we'll start off with the purchasing user group. This is the most basic group that you will probably be granting to every user that you set up in your system. And that's because it gives you the ability to create a purchase requisition in Ariba and also to run reports against your own transactional data and those of your subordinates, so anybody who reports to you. Out of the box, you are limited to that much visibility. You're also able to create change orders for your own purchase orders as well. So that's the most basic group that you'll probably assign to every system user. The next level up is purchasing agent. And as I mentioned previously, this is typically someone who deals with non-standard or ad hoc items on a requisition. Therefore, you probably want to grant this to people in your purchasing organization, typically someone in the role of a buyer who can facilitate those types of transactions and make sure the vendor and the pricing is appropriate. Another key function of purchasing agent is for those suppliers who are not enabled on the Ariba network. For those suppliers, they will be generating what we call manual purchase orders. The purchasing agent is responsible for dispatching those POs to the supplier outside of the Ariba network, and then coming back into the P2P system and marking them as dispatched, basically marking them as ordered. So that's a very important function of purchasing agent as well, is to deal with those manual suppliers that are not enabled on the Ariba network. And as I mentioned earlier, this particular group receives quite a lot of email notifications just by the nature of their role. Next up is purchasing manager group. That is one level higher. And that's generally given to super users within your purchasing department. So a purchasing manager has some extended capabilities, such as they can create change orders and cancel orders even for other people's transactions. They also have the ability to reopen purchase orders that have been closed, and they have enterprise-wide visibility. That is what we call query all access. So if they're running a system search or a report, they can look at data enterprise-wide. So keep in mind, this is a very powerful group, and oftentimes it is granted hand in hand with purchasing agent because the same person in many cases needs to be able to perform both actions. Finally, at the top of the purchasing food chain is purchasing administrator. And as with all administrator roles, it should be granted cautiously because, again, this is a very powerful role. Someone who has this group does have the ability to remove approvers from the approval flow. A regular end user cannot do that, but a purchasing administrator can. So just keep in mind that very few people should have this group, and most likely they may be the same people that have the purchasing manager group. Next, we'll move on to a category we call accounts payable groups. And the groups that you'll see in this section primarily have to do with invoicing and payments. So first up, we have a group called invoice agent. An invoice agent has two key functions. The first is they are able to create or key in invoices directly in Ariba. So unlike those invoices that come from the Ariba network, if they are a manual supplier not enabled on the Ariba network who is sending us a paper invoice or emailing us or faxing us an invoice, the invoice agent may key that in directly into Ariba. Their second key function is when an invoice comes in and it goes through the reconciliation process, if we've detected any discrepancies, many of these discrepancies out of the box will route to the invoice agent group for processing and handling. So it's up to the invoice agent to decide what to do with those invoices which have discrepancies. The next group is called the invoice entry user. This group is often actually not used because if you are using invoice agent, that is sufficient. It can perform all the same functions. But some customers do have a segregation of duty. And if you have different users that are responsible for keying in the invoices versus reconciling the invoices, then you can leverage this group. And this group can be used simply to key in the invoices only. And you can have the separate invoice agent group for exception handling. So that's where invoice entry user comes into play, is if you have that type of a segregation of duty in your organization. Next, we have a series of groups called invoice entry user. And there is an invoice entry user for PO and contract-based invoices, and a separate invoice entry user group for non-PO invoice entry. And these groups are just what the names imply. They give you the ability to key in that type of invoice directly in Ariba. So if you have a segregation of duty, you can have separate invoice entry functions for PO and contract-based invoices versus non-PO invoices. One step above all those groups is the invoice manager group. And this is generally given to people within accounts payable who you consider super users. So this has the ability to do a lot of the things invoice agent can do, plus has access to the invoice exception configuration. What types of discrepancies are we looking for? And for each invoice exception that we're looking for, do we have any tolerances? Also, if those invoice exceptions occur, who should they route to? All that type of configuration is something that the invoice manager has access to. And finally, the most powerful AP group is the invoice administrator. And this gives you the ability to access much of the behind-the-scenes configuration. It allows you to alter approval flows on an invoice document and on an invoice reconciliation document. And if things get stuck for some reason, which should rarely or if ever happen, they have access to some of the force functions, like force reconciliation and force payment. These should be rare if ever, but the invoice administrator does have access to those functions. Next up, we have the invoice exception processor group. If you belong to this group, you have the ability to reconcile invoice exceptions. So generally, people who have the invoice agent group that we talked about earlier, they also will be assigned to invoice exception processor. That way, when an invoice routes to them, they have access to all the various functions, such as accepting the invoice, rejecting the invoice, editing the invoice, and so forth. So usually those two groups go hand in hand. Sometimes the invoice exception processor group is also granted to people who are in the purchasing groups as well, if they're responsible to handle invoice exceptions. Next up, we have the invoice referral specialist group. And this is an important one. When an invoice comes in, if it has detected we have a discrepancy, it will throw an invoice exception. One of the functions that an exception handler will see on their screen is a refer button. When they click the refer button, it will bring up a user search. You have the ability to search for and choose any user in the system who belongs to the invoice referral specialist group. That is the key. It will not bring up the entire user base, but only people who belong to this particular group. And the reason you would use this is when something comes to you for exception handling and you realize you're either not the right person or you don't have the information necessary. So you would like to refer this invoice to somebody else to process. If that is the case, you would click that refer button, go into the search, and you would have a list of people who belong to this particular group, the invoice referral specialist group, to choose from. Finally, we have the financial processing analyst group. And this group is an optional group, but we often see it assigned to accounts payable resources. And it's generally performing two functions. One is that if you belong to this group, you have access enterprise-wide to data. So if you are running a search or a report within the system, you would be able to pull data across the enterprise. And that's why oftentimes accounts payable people need this to perform their function, their job function. Sometimes we also see this used on an approval flow as a catch-all. So if you have exceeded a very large dollar amount, or you've exceeded the number of approvers in a particular approval chain, sometimes financial processing analyst is at the end as a catch-all, just to make sure that somebody is pulled into the approval flow in those cases. Next up, we have a number of groups specific to contracts in Ariba. So the first one is contract agent, and that simply is going to be assigned to anyone who needs to create a contract request within the system. All contracts in Ariba start off as contract requests, and only once those contract requests are approved do they actually become live contracts. Keep in mind, a blanket purchase order or a BPO is a type of contract in Ariba. One step above that is the contract manager. They have the ability to query all contracts. So again, that is enterprise-wide visibility to all contract data. And they're often included in contract requests approval flows. It's quite a common requirement to have them as the person who has oversight when a contract request is submitted. Oftentimes, contract agent and contract manager are assigned to the same people if you have a small group performing the contracts function. The highest step in the food chain with contracts is the contract administrator, and that provides the ability to remove approvals on contract requests. So again, a standard end user cannot alter the approval flow to remove anyone, but a contract administrator and all the administrative functions do have that ability. Therefore, they should be granted with caution. Just one note, even if a contract administrator does remove someone from an approval flow, it is noted in the History tab, so there is a full audit trail. The next major functional area is reporting. And within that, there are several groups. The first one is report user. Report user often goes hand in hand with purchasing user. In fact, it's not necessary if you have purchasing user because you have the same abilities with the purchasing user group. Specifically, those abilities are to run reports for your own transactional data and for anyone who reports to you. So if you have assigned purchasing user to your user base, you probably don't need the report user group. But if you have people accessing the system simply to run reports, that's when you would use this separate group. One step up from that is the report manager group, which is for those folks you consider super users who need to run a wide variety of reports. They have access to a wide variety of reports, and they also have access to enterprise-wide data, so they can pull back any data throughout the entire system. Another key point here is they have the ability to modify prepackaged reports. Those are the reports that come with the system, of which there's quite a large set that comes with Ariba. And they also have the ability to create custom reports. Finally, you have the report administrator group, and people who belong to that group have access to some advanced tasks, things like report scheduling, and therefore should only be assigned to a central administrative type of person. Finally, the last category of groups are what we call special groups. And these groups are only assigned in special cases. For example, the no ad hoc item group. This is assigned to users who you want to limit to strictly choosing from catalog items. So when a user is creating a purchase requisition, they may only choose items that are in the catalog. They may not elect to add a non-standard or ad hoc item to their shopping cart. They will not even see that option in their menu if they belong to this particular group. Similarly, there's another group called no escalation. Anyone who belongs to this group is exempt from escalation in Ariba. Escalation is a function to help ensure that approvals are done in a timely basis. Generally, if you have escalation turned on, after X number of days of inactivity, an approver is sent a warning from Ariba that a particular item is still waiting for their attention. After X number of days, if they still have not taken action, the item will actually escalate to the next person in the approval flow. Again, this is if you have the escalation features enabled. Generally, you do not want things escalating all the way up to senior management. And so those types of people are given this group, no escalation. That way, even if there is an item that should normally escalate based on the time that's elapsed, if the next person in line belongs to the no escalation group, we will not bother them. Ariba will not escalate that item to that person, but rather it will stay with the approver that it's stuck on. There's another group called no supervisor within Ariba. This one should be granted sparingly. In general, every user within your Ariba system should have a supervisor. That is how we establish a supervisor chain in the system, which quite often drives approval flows. But sometimes there are senior executives or people very high up that should not have a supervisor defined in the system. If that's the case, you want to assign them to this particular group, and that way they are exempt from having a supervisor assigned. Next up is the finance group. As I mentioned earlier, this is generally used as a catch-all or a fallback group. So if we've climbed up an approval chain, for example, and we've exceeded everyone's dollar approval limit, finance can be added as a cap at the end. So oftentimes we'll see this group used in that capacity, but it is optional. There is also a group called P2P authorized, and this gives you access to the Ariba system strictly for approval purposes. So if you have some people accessing your system just as approvers, this is the group you want to give them, and therefore they will not be able to create any transactions, but they will be able to view and approve transactions if they're on the approval flow. Next up, there's also a group called Catalog Approver. When you have catalogs in Ariba, generally you have suppliers on the Ariba network who will provide you those catalogs. Those catalogs will be automatically downloaded into Ariba and sent to the catalog approver for their review. Remember, the catalog should have your pre-negotiated items and pricing in it only. So it's the catalog approver's job to check the content of that catalog and make sure it's appropriate before that catalog can become live and available to your users. That's the function of the catalog approver group. And sometimes this is broken down with custom groups based on vendors or commodity categories. But out of the box, all catalogs will route to the catalog approver group, who reviews the catalog before promoting it to be live. So those are all the key groups that we just stepped through that you probably want people assigned to at a minimum in order to run your Ariba system. There are quite a few other groups in addition that you will see in the user and groups workbook, but this is just intended to give you an idea of the key groups to keep in mind. Now, as far as next steps, as I mentioned earlier, you have a couple key pieces of user group documentation to review, and that will help you get used to what groups come with the system and what permissions each group grants you. So that in particular is the user group workbook that will give you an idea of that. You may also review the notifications guide, which will let you know that if you're assigned to a particular group, what notifications can you expect to receive. Once you have an idea of what the groups are and what permissions come with them, the next exercise is to basically map the job function you have in your enterprise to the Ariba group that you will need to perform that function. This is largely an exercise of narrowing down all the groups that come with Ariba just to those that are required to perform those particular job functions. Once you have the groups narrowed down, then you can actually begin the exercise of mapping those groups to users. The user groups workbook is an excellent tool to help you with this exercise to first map Ariba groups to your job functions, and then once you've narrowed down the groups, in turn to map those groups to users. In the beginning, we recommend to establish at least a subset of users, primarily your core team or the core testers, with the appropriate groups in your test site. That way they can go through and actually start performing testing once you have the configuration in place. After that, the rest of the user base can be mapped accordingly. Hopefully now you have a good idea of what groups come with the Ariba system and the various touch points or functions that groups impact within Ariba, which are quite a few. Thank you for listening to this recording.